we really have a problem with about 97% of churches. Southern Baptists, now I admit they're evangelical. Over half their churches in the year 2015 didn't record at least one salvation baptism. Not one, over half. So what has happened to the church in America is we've become a very inwardly focused church. You know, we sit in worship and boy, we glorify God, but we don't know that a visitor who came in with everything we did with one another walked out and nobody even talked to them. You with me? So let me talk a little bit in general. Bishop and I met and discussed it. After 9/11, your church here took a bump. We call it an event bump. You're going to get a few of them during the year. You're going to get a Christmas bump. You're going to get an Easter bump. You're going to get a crisis in the land, a 9/11 bump. Basically what you do is you take those numbers and throw them out. Okay? The reason is they're bumps. They're like going down a smooth road and hitting one of those speed bumps. Knocks you up in the air, down you come again. So for quite a few years, this church has hovered somewhere between 400 and 450 in average worship attendance. Now, I need to tell you that that number is not the real number. The real number in this church is a third larger than that. So the real number is somewhere around 650 to 700. Why is that? Some people attend every 4 Sundays. Some people attend 3 out of 4. Some people attend 2 out of 4. And some people come once a month. In America, the typical pattern is the average loyal church member goes twice a month. If you took all the people who attended 1 Sunday a month or 2 Sundays a month, and you got each of those people to attend 1 Sunday per month more than they're doing now, your attendance would jump by 25%. So one way to break through barriers is increasing frequency of attendance. In fact, you've got a pool right now of somewhere around 200 plus people who call this church home but don't come regularly. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, when they get me, we're going to talk about the life cycle and the paradigms and all the other things. Churches, when they grow, there are natural barriers. Lyle Schaller likens those to the difference between a cat and a dog and a garden and a house and a nation. Now, look, a dog isn't just a large cat. And a big dog isn't a garden. And a garden isn't a house. So what ends up happening as churches grow, they reach the barriers where they're a full garden. Or they're a huge dog. Or they're a contented cat. But they don't know how to make the transition from one to the other. That's why you hear, what do you do to break the 75 barrier? What do you do to break the 200 barrier? What do you do to break the 400 barrier? What do you do to break the 800 barrier? And what do you do to break the 2,000 barrier? Now, churches over 800 are in the top 1 percentile of the 350,000 churches in America. They're in the top 1 percentile. Churches in your category between 4 and 8 are in the next 4%. So your church, right where it is now, would be in the top 5% of all the churches in the country. Now, why is that important? Quite frankly, folks, you've never been there before. So what happens is you develop what are called paradigms in ministry. That is the way you do things. So, for example, I've been in meetings with leaders here, and they will tell me, this is how we do things here. The question is not how are you doing them, but are they working? Different kind of question. Okay? It's an assumed truth in all of life. You can't keep doing what you're doing and get a different result. Okay? So what we're going to do, hopefully, is it coming? Hopefully what we're going to do is I'm going to deal with 2 issues with you over the next 6 weeks. We'll spend about an hour each time, I think is the plan, Bishop. What we're going to do is I'm going to address what a paradigm and what a life cycle and how a church gets stuck. And I want you to understand it. Because if you don't understand it, whenever we say, this is what you've got to do to break the 800 barrier, this is what you've got to do, what you're going to do is scratch your head and say, why would we need to do that? Because I like church the way it is. That's the difficulty. The first rule that you ever learn about in church growth is you've got to want to grow. The second rule is very much like it. You have to be willing to pay the price. Okay? All of you guys know this. You date a girl, and that's the dream. That's what you want. But you better go to the jewelry store and pay the price, or you ain't getting her. Everybody understand that principle? Yeah, and then the third thing, which is pretty easy, is you then need to learn and apply the principles. Okay? And the principles are what we're going to focus on. For example, when you become more than 800, you're actually getting into a category where the infrastructure of the church is more important than the worship. Your staff role, your staff are less dependent upon doing anything and more focused on equipping and developing other leaders. There's all sorts of transitions that need to be made. And those transitions, for many of us, are painful. Because we know that comfort is usually, for 90% of people, their number one priority. Very few people, how many of you love change? Put up your hands. Love it. I mean, love it. Okay, we got half a dozen in the group, maybe. Okay, how many of you hate change? Put up your hand, come on. And how many of you are not sure if you like it or love it? Yeah, the majority. So you've got to be convinced. You've got to be brought along. There's actually, in change, studies of change, what is called a bell curve. There are 2% of people who get on board with every new idea they think will work. Welcome, Bishop. You're the one. You're in that 2 percentile range. Well, what he's got to do is he's got to get along his leaders on board. He's got to get that 18% of people who are what are called his early adopters. They're the people who are going to grab onto something very, very quickly. At the other end, there's going to be people who are going to look at him and say, you're doing what? And some of them will get so ticked off they'll even leave. But trust me, there's about 2% of people who are vocally antagonistic to any change that occurs. But there's about 18% that just want to wait around for a while and see if it works. The majority, the 60% in the middle, are the people that are listening for a promise, listening for a vision, listening for someone who will lead them forward. In other words, they're not antagonistic and they're not pro either. What they are is they want convinced. Is the price worth it? Are we doing things that matter? They're people that are part of what is called in politics that silent majority. And we've seen it all year in the political cycle. We've seen early adopters, we've seen late adopters, we've seen antagonists, and we've seen pioneers. We've seen it. And that's what happens. All right, can you guys tell me where I'm at? Okay, let me make one more observation before I get into the notes, and I hope they'll come up pretty quick. There are three major issues that intersect and coincide that creates the plateau. The first issue or item that creates the plateau is always the sociological phenomena. All churches are social groups. The reason they're social groups is people get together. They interact with one another. They love one another. And you develop in that group the cultural and social mores of the group. Now, why is that important? Social organizations have a tendency to grow up for the first 15 to 20 years, and then they level out. How long have you been here, Bishop? 35 years. So you are in, not that up period, but that next 20-year plateau period. My guess is we go back, we're going back at least 10 years because we're going back to 2001 for 9/11. And it's been 400 around, 450, been around there for a long time. So the church grew up in that first 20 years, levels out, and then after about 40 years, guess what? It starts to trickle down. Now, how important is that, or how important is that? Do you know that the average profitability of a business peaks after 20 years? And if the business doesn't reinvent itself, it levels out, declines, and goes out. Target is so convinced of that, or Kmart, pardon me. I'm thinking of Target and all their stupidity, but Kmart. I was with the executives Kmart. They asked me to do a consultation on life cycles. They have instituted a policy that they either close or remodel every store every 5 years. And they say that after 4.5 years, the life cycle of that store has peaked and its profitability either levels out or drops down. And they're so afraid of dropping down, they would rather close the store, remodel the store, re-envision the store, or do something like that. So that's the sociological part of it. You are a social organization. The second part of it is what is called a paradigm. Now, a paradigm is the rules. It's the way we do things. When you play football, there's a paradigm. There's a line of scrimmage, and you can't cross it. There are sidelines, and you can't go out of bounds. You know, there are rules for blocking and tackling, and that's how we play the game. It has a paradigm. So when you come to church, what's your paradigm? How do you dress? What language do you use? Where do you sit? What's the paradigm? How do you run things? What's the program? How do you do things? One of the questions I have a tendency to ask is hard questions. What's the last major thing you changed? If it's in distant memory, your paradigm is probably irrelevant. You with me? If we keep doing, well, let me take it to marriage. If I keep treating my wife Margaret the way I treated her when she was 20 years old, is the same, if I treat her the same, my marriage is going to fall apart. Why? Because I've got to change the way I love her. I've got to change the way I care for her. I've got to change the way I provide for her. I've got to change. Why? Because it's a paradigm. Now, paradigms, interestingly, have a life cycle. The life cycle of a paradigm doesn't start at ground zero. The life cycle of a new paradigm starts up from the bottom of the chart, and you'll see this when we put it up. Comes from up at the bottom of the chart. Why? Because after a while, somebody wakes up and says the old way of doing things isn't working. It's answering some of our questions, but the unanswered questions are haunting us. So you now have that questioning stage, and new ideas start to get in place. The people who do that are called paradigm pioneers. They're the people who help get the new things going. They are more content with results than they are comfort. Okay? Now what happens when you develop a new paradigm and you start doing things new, and particularly if the new things you're doing are working, it grows. The organization grows. The way of doing things works. But guess what? Eventually it stops working too. Why? Because the world has changed. And the old way of doing things doesn't match up to the new way of doing things. That's your paradigms. And so the paradigm that when a church is stuck, and you know, I've heard it from at least half a dozen people here when I've talked about different things. They'll all say to me, this is how we do it around Shield of Faith. And I'm going to tell you something. Listen carefully. The church is plateaued, and this is how you're doing it around here doesn't work. Okay. So there has to be changes. Are the changes big? I don't know. Are the changes small? I don't know. Are there changes? Yes. Yeah, that's the big thing. So there's also a paradigm. The third kind of issue that relates to that plateau before you start putting the pieces in place to build over 800 is the life cycle of a dream. The dream that you have has a cycle in it. Let me explain something to you. One of my good friends has passed away. His name was Robert Schuller. Some of you may know Robert Schuller in building the Crystal Cathedral. The Crystal Cathedral was the first glass church ever built in America, and built in an earthquake zone, I might tell you. Robert Schuller had interviewed 34 of the top architects in the country, sharing his vision of a glass church. You know what they all said? It can't be done. And they gave all the reasons. Glass cracks. Okay? It's going to be a bear to clean. You can't structurally build a building that's safe all with glass. I mean, they gave every excuse under the sun. Dr. Schuller came in to one of the architects that he liked a lot, and he sat down and said this. He said, he said, you've told me it can't be done, but tell me, if it could be done, how would we do it? The end product of that is you take the blinders off and you see the possibilities of the future rather than the past. One other illustration over here at Cal Poly Pomona. How many of you know that the jaws of life were invented there? Yeah. There was the architectural design class, and the professor went in, and here's what the professor said. He divided the class into two groups, said to one group, I want you to design a can opener. The other group, he gave a different assignment. He said, I want you to design something that will cut metal. When they finished, the group that was asked to design a can opener looked like every other can opener you'd ever seen, because they all had images of what a can opener looks like, what it feels like, what it does. When you had the issue of something to cut metal, then they started asking all sorts of possibility questions. What if it could cut steel that's a half-inch thick? What if it could be portable? What if? What if? What if? The end product is they developed the first of that. It was then developed, and the jaws of life are used all over the world. Creativity. Now, when I knew Bob Schuller, I was with him the Sunday he moved in to the Crystal Cathedral, first Sunday in. I watched him. He stood up, and the building was paid for the first Sunday they moved in. I mean, the vision was so powerful that people literally emptied their wallets to make sure the vision became a reality. You know, Bob Schuller's church was never larger at that point than it ever was. Never grew beyond that point. Do you know why? The dream was complete. There was no new dream. as a okay, now the pastor, just to give you an idea, a pastor can go into a church and have a dream. And you start off in a little storefront, you start off renting some space, and then your dream is to get a new facility. And you get the facility, and all of a sudden your church gets stuck. What's your real dream? The real dreams that matter are missiological in nature. What would it matter if the vision of your church was to touch every person who's out of the good news of the gospel in our ministry area within the next 5 years? How would it work? Be different. All right. So what we have intersecting, which one are you going to put up? Okay, you're going to put up paradigm shifts. Good. So what you have intersecting is a life cycle, a paradigm, and a dream. So by the time we are finished, you're going to know what a church has to do to break the life cycle. You're going to know what it takes to think through the paradigm issues. And by the last session, Bishop's going to go up and share the vision for you of what he wants to see God do. Because you see, I can't give you the vision. I can give you a frame of reference in which the vision can come. In other words, the values that you then hold. We want to see our community reached with the gospel of Christ. We want to see this church become everything God created to be. When you've got those beliefs deep in your soul, guess what? The vision will find happy ground. All right. Let's go to the next slide. I think that's the word that we're going to use, right? Have they got me back there? Okay. There we go. Okay, here's, what are we, we're in the paradigm. Let me get the oh, he's got the wrong one up there. Let me see if I can get that. Let me see where he is, and I can switch my notes to a different place. No, he's not anywhere near where I am. Well, he doesn't have my computer anymore. Okay, I'll tell you what. It's 7:15, and we're finished at 7. Let me go without notes. Okay. The PowerPoint he has is called Anticipating Paradigm Shifts, and the first picture is that one, picture of a. Okay. Okay. If he doesn't get to that, let me go with dealing with some life cycle issues, and let me come back to the paradigm because I think I can do this very simply. Now, before we get grounded, I heard Bishop address this as I was sitting at the back there. The church is 3 things biblically. It is a living organism. You are the body of Christ. The second thing is the church is a well-run organization. Let all things be done decently and in order. You're the building of Christ. So in the church, you have both people issues and structural issues. You can have good people in a bad structure, and you can have a good structure with people that aren't on board. You need both. The third thing that the church is a living dream. One of the things that is very difficult to learn, but absolutely essential to practice, is the dream in your heart has to keep growing. Okay? God will not keep you stuck, ever. That's not his plan. So the dream has to keep going. Donald McGavran, at the age of 74, started the School of World Missions. At 74, started it. You know that he wrote more books after the age of 70 than he did before? I started the CSCU seminary. And some of the work we've been doing with Dr. Alexander, I started that when I was 63. You say, why does that work? Because every day I pray, Lord, help me never to become content where I am. I pray it every single day. And you know the interesting thing? Here I am, one of the old guys. But I've got all these young pastors who are 21, 22, 30, young thing. Who do they want for advice? Not somebody who's 45 and soured. They'd rather have somebody that's 100 and alive. You're with me? Yeah. So the church is always a living dream and keeping the dream alive. And I prayed it in my own life, started praying it about 8 or 9 years ago. And I prayed it because I was watching, as I was in pastoral ministry and helping churches, I found myself so out of sync with my colleagues because they got to be 55, 56, and they could start to see their retirement on the horizon. And so they were just trying to keep things together and keep everything working and keep everything happy and not upset the apple cart. Because they were more interested. I'll tell you this, my wife will tell you. Ask my wife this question, and I'm not there. She says, will Bob retire? She says, when they put him into a box. Yeah. Okay, this is the one where, yes, that'll do fine. That'll do fine. All right, we're here. Now, all right, can you move to the next slide? We're going to move through this very quickly. Okay, keep coming. We're looking at how this dream, we're going to pinpoint the dream first. This is how we're going to look at the dream. What you're going to see here, very quickly, now don't move, okay, just stay there for a moment. What you're going to see is here's how the dream works. You see, everything starts with an idea. Everything starts with a seed that is planted in your heart. Sometimes that seed is a direct word from God. Sometimes it's an open opportunity put before you by God. You see the difference? Some people are sitting in their prayer closet saying, God, speak to me. And there's hungry people all around you that need to be fed. I mean, God speaks through His Word, through your worship with Him and your community with Him, but He speaks to you by opening doors. So there's always the dream. Now, a dream needs values. So, for example, if I as a pastor say to you, why don't you invite your friends and neighbors, the people you work with, why don't you invite them to come to church with you? Now, you would admit, because most of you are leaders, you would admit that that's a very worthy goal, right? What happens if the people in the church don't really believe that lost people matter to God and don't matter to them either? They won't answer, they won't respond. So, part of what you're building as a church is you're actually building a set of values that are conducive to the fulfillment of the dream. Interesting enough, this is just a little aside. A few years ago, I came to the conclusion that values in a church were important. And let me tell you the story. I was in New York, and I was doing a consultation with a Reformed church in Harlem. And they had called a new pastor, a great guy. And the church had been stuck, get this, for close to 40 years. Stuck somewhere around 125, 130 people, and a few people came, a few people left, but all around 125. They came and they said to the young pastor, we need to grow. He did. He went out and started reaching the Puerto Ricans and started reaching the other people in the community and brought them in and started kids programs. And pretty soon the worship was well up over 200 people within about 5 months. And the board called him into a meeting wanting to fire him. You scratch your head and you say, what's wrong with leading 75 people to Christ? but they wanted to fire him. So the denomination, in their wonderful wisdom, says, Bob, could you go out and help solve the problem? There's a rule I learned in consulting: never work with churches in conflict. Conflict trumps everything. So I go out and I meet with I don't have the pastor there, I meet with the board. And so I ask the board the questions, and I take them through, and I said, you've seen new people come to the church, and that was what you had initially wanted to see happen. Tell us what's going on. Tell me about what you're feeling. They said, well, they don't clean up like we do. They don't look after our building the way we do. They don't dress when they come to church like they're supposed to. I said, but they're lost and found. But they've got to be like us. I went to the pastor, met with the pastor, and as we began talking, he began to weep. He said, I've learned something. As long as there's one lost person in our community, our church needs to be one larger than it is now. He had a passion for souls. Well, what happened is the value that the pastor held was lost people matter to God. The value that the church held is keeping our church the way it always has been is the most important thing we do. Now, why is that important? Well, I ended up taking that idea and studying the difference between growing, plateaued, and declining churches on the values that the church has held. Here was the interesting thing. Churches that have values that are compatible to evangelism grow. Churches that don't have values compatible to evangelism don't grow. And here's the interesting thing. We took an experiment of 50 churches that had bad values and put a process in place to change the values, and 75% of those churches were growing within 6 months. I will give to Bishop the hard copy of the report. The report was submitted to the Harvard Review of Religious Research and was considered the top piece of religious research in America. So you'll get a copy of that, and you can distribute it to everyone that would like it. All right, now what ends up happening once you've set the beliefs, then you're going to say, how are we going to get it? And you set some goals. I mean, I heard you at annual meetings setting goals. The goals need to have feet. They need to have a structure. Now, the structure, listen carefully, becomes the paradigm. It becomes the paradigm. It becomes the way we do things. So when you set a structure in place and you're not getting any fruit, if the dream came from God, the problem's the structure, the way you're doing it. You're tracking with me? Now what happens is that structure leads to the peak, which is where the rapid growth occurs. So for example, when you first moved here, I'll bet you, I haven't even talked to you about it, and you know this, I'll bet you when you first moved in, there was a spurt that went like this. Yeah, it had a big spurt. No, it may not have been millions, but it was certainly dozens and dozens of people that came in. Why? Well, the ministry resulted in the dream, the belief, the goals, the structures. But what ends up happening is after a period of time, you go over to a period of nostalgia where you remember how it was, not how it's going to be. That nostalgia leads to the tension through the questioning. Some people say, we really are not baptizing people like we ought to. We really are not reaching people in the community like we ought to. Things that we're doing aren't really working like they used to. There's some questioning. And now what happens is there becomes tension. And the tension or the polarization comes because there's a difference between what people want and what people want. Some want the change, some want the old way. The tendency is for those who want the old way to go back and tweak the structure. They come back and tweak the structure. Put on the next arrow and you'll see this. Next arrow, please. Okay, I'm going to tell you what the next arrow is. The next arrow over here is dropout. That's where the people that... What do you do with Jesus? He says, pray the Lord of the harvest that he'll send laborers into his field. If you're not in his field, he'll take you to somewhere that is. And what ends up happening? Have you ever noticed that quite often the pattern is that when there's that kind of tension in a church, it's not the bad people who leave, it's the good ones. You know why? The Lord of the harvest is moving the unwilling of the church to a place where the willing are willing to use them. Okay? Now, here's what happens. When you're over here on this side, and if you can change the arrow, it would be good. The next arrow goes like this, down to dream. What ends up happening? Whenever you start to see a tie-in of the dream that has a lot of nostalgia attached to it, that doesn't have a strong future orientation, then at that point what you need is a new dream. The book that you'll want to read is by Robert Dale, and the book is called To Dream Again. Robert Dale, To Dream Again. Okay, there it is there. You see that? You go back. Anytime your church is stuck, you've got a vision issue. Every time your church is stuck, there's always a vision issue. Because the vision is what compels the pilgrimage. Okay? If you've got a dream big enough, Aristotle Onassis, everybody acknowledge he was pretty wealthy? Wealthiest man in the world. He was asked the question. He said, what would you do if you lost everything? He says, what I would do is, he said, I'd go and become a waiter in the finest restaurants in Paris. And I would treat the businessmen who were coming for lunch as well as I could, paying attention to everything they said. He said, pretty soon I'd find an idea that was so good that they had thrown away that I'd make all my money back again. He says, because money always chases good ideas. Some of you young people that are here, you get a dream big enough, you'll have a business that's very successful. Pastors, you got a dream big enough, you'll have a great church. The dream is critical. All right, let's go on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide, whether they are or not. So, the church's Oh, they're just a couple ahead of me. We'll have notes. Okay. Now, here's what happens. A church's paradigm defines what a church is, how it operates. It's the set of habits, attitudes, and approaches that affect everything we do. So, for example, and I'm not talking out of school. Bishop has actually talked about a way to start to shorten the length of the worship service. Now, why is he doing that? Because you like 2-hour worship? No, because unsaved people won't sit in a church they don't know for 2 hours. Okay? So, what do? You say, how can we do a both and? How can we minister to the saints, and how can we reach lost people? What can we do? Just go here. Now, can you get to the slide that says Paradigm Life Cycle? It's a picture, and there are lots of parts of it. No, that's the one following that. Your one should be one back. Okay. Don't worry about it. Let me go on with it. A paradigm, and by the way, Bishop, next week, if we could get a whiteboard, just something that I can scribble. If we run into a tech problem, I can actually teach without it. You're not doing it. Okay. Now, when we discuss the paradigm, if you were to take a square piece of paper, and I'll just take a piece of paper here with you, okay? You're going to take a square piece of paper, and I'm going to make a drawing, and then I'll show it to you. Okay. What you're seeing is, how many of you can see that little paper? A few of you? Basically, you're taking a chart graph like this, and the top one is how effectiveness works. The bottom is how long it works, time. Okay? Everything eventually runs out of steam. Law of thermodynamics. Everything, churches, businesses. You know that 95% of businesses stop growing by their 15th or 20th birthday. Yeah. Standard. This stuff, by the way, is taught in any standard business school about how to build a business. How do you keep your business growing when the natural sociological tendencies will stop your business from growing? So what ends up happening on this is the paradigm starts, as I discussed, slightly above the bottom. And it doesn't seem to work for a while. Okay? It's sort of like getting on a diet. You try and try and try, and then you finally drop a pound. You know, it's the thing that you got to work at for a while. You got to work at it for a while, and you've got to give it a long enough test to know whether the strategy is working or not. If the idea is working or not. You have to do that. So, for example, if there's a paradigm shift, and you meet with your staff, and we'll talk in more detail about this. You meet with your staff and you say, what I need you to do is start meeting with 3 to 5 people every week that you're going to develop as leaders. Now, that doesn't happen next week for reporting. It comes next week to say, how are you doing about putting the list together with people? How are you doing about contacting them so you can disciple them and bring them close to you? You've got to have process. Now, by the time they start that process, you might be 90 days in. By the time you're a year into that training process of a leader, you might see fruit. Okay? A good farmer doesn't plant a seed and then watch to see if it's growing. What he does is he keeps nurturing the seed, pouring water on it, putting fertilizer on it, and then he sees the harvest after all that work. The work is not in starting. In fact, the scripture says, finishing is harder than starting. Finishing is harder than starting. Now, let me talk about the paradigms that might be good. They gave up on me. Okay. Basically what happens is you can reach the point that you've continued to do something for so long that it is virtually impossible to change. In other words, you're well mixed and thoroughly set like concrete. So one of the keys to effective organization, and I'm telling you, one of the reasons I appreciate Bishop, he and I have known each other for what, at least 10 years, Bishop? Maybe more than that. And we've sat in his office for hours, bouncing ideas back and forth, talking about the church here, talking about the church around the world. What you have as a church is one of the great blessings. You have a flexible leader. Well, the reason I know he's a flexible leader is he's brought me here to say things that are going to challenge him, and he knows it. Because he's more interested in seeing the church become everything God wanted it to be than him having security as the apostle. And I know his heart. So I told him, I'm going to talk about some stuff that is going to be uncomfortable, and he knew it. So when that paradigm, when you keep doing things too long, you've got a window. It's like the church on the plateau for a long period of time. There's the window where it's easier to get the changes made and the growth occurring, rather than a crisis that causes it. Like a lot of churches get, there's a church I was working with out in Rancho Cucamonga. The problem is they ended up not doing the right things long enough that they were upside down in their loan and the church closed. So they delayed doing the right things for too long. That's the crisis. But here's the interesting thing. The best way to change your paradigm is before the old paradigm stops working. You go from glory to glory, not from hell to glory. Oh, they got it. All right. Now I can explain this. You with me on that? So here we are. On this side, you have the problem solved. This is the time. Notice how I said at the bottom, there's this little gap. Okay? When you reach the point that it starts to work, it becomes the predominant paradigm. That's the B stage. That's when things really are working. That's when you can say, what we're doing works. Okay? When you get up here and you start to see it's not working as well as it is, you notice the little turn there? Then it's at that point, you know you can't tweak it. You've got to have a new paradigm. And so you're going back to that principle. The best time to introduce a new paradigm is the middle to late period of the old paradigm. Because a crisis is never predictable. Okay? Next slide. Next slide. Oh, he's got the wrong one for me. That's all right. Don't worry about it. I'm going to do one more. He pulled some stuff off my computer, and I'm not sure he's looking at the same stuff I am. Okay, let me make a couple of interesting observations, and then I think this is probably a good place to quit. 90% of all churches peak by their 15th anniversary and are never larger. And where they stop by their 15th anniversary is 75, 200, 400, 800. Here's what happens. When you, and this is why I'm starting with this rather than the 800 paradigm. When you are stuck, you have to admit you're stuck. You have to understand that we're not going to put a Band-Aid or lipstick on a pig. We're actually going to make the fundamental changes that's going to make our church healthier, stronger, and reaching more people with the gospel. What's that? All right. Okay. Now, this life cycle, although it's seen in all organizations, here's the interesting thing. It is natural, but it is not inevitable. And I'm going to say something to you. Tom Mercer, you know Tom. Tom's been in High Desert Church for 25, 30 years. The church has gone from less than 100 people to over 15,000 and I think 5 new satellite churches that are going. Okay? 70% of all the people who become part of their church are first-time converts. Tom hasn't had the life cycle affect him at all. Do you know why? The dream of reaching people was big enough that he made every change he needed to make along the way. You see, pastors. How many different pastors we got here? Quite a few. I noticed a few shirts on backwards. I've got one too, so I can joke with it. Hey, when you're in a church, you're going to spend a lot of time with nickels and noses. You're going to look at how many people were in worship and how much did we take in offering and what's this? Who's in the hospital that I got to visit? And who I got to counsel? And I mean, trust me, you can be as busy in a church of 50 as you can in a church of 5,000. The only difference is the pastors of larger churches know what to do that's effective to do. They don't work hard, they work effectively. You know, it's been fascinating to me because there are only about 1,200 churches of over 2,000 in the country. Okay? I know over half of them. And those pastors don't work nearly as hard as the pastors of churches of 100. They work a lot smarter. They've trained good leaders all around them. So when you say as a leader, as one pastor told me, he says, I don't want more people. More people mean more problems. I got all the problems I can handle. You can develop in your own heart a resistance to growth because you can only envision yourself as busier. You can't envision yourself as better. That makes sense? All right, it's 7:15, Bishop. God bless, sir.
Give God real praise and appreciate the man of God for excellent. Come on, stand up and give God praise and be appreciative and be excited. Come on, y'all not excited. Give God praise. Thank you, Dr. Orr. Thank you for a fantastic foundation. Let's stand to pray. We're going to receive the offering as well, but let's stand to pray. Grab hands with your neighbor, and we pray that God will use this. Now, help me pray, everybody. Now, Lord, we thank you for the things that this wonderful man of God has shared with us, Lord, as a